The KV1, a machine whose very silhouette carved fear into the snow-frozen winds of the Eastern Front, did not arrive as a whisper or a rumor but as a thunderous reminder that the Soviet Union had forged something far beyond the expectations of German intelligence, and long before the Wehrmacht understood what stood before them, the massive slabs of steel, the thick cast armor, and the unwavering resolve of its crew were already rewriting the brutal logic of mechanized warfare, because the KV-1 was not merely a tank, it was a declaration, a challenge hurled into the winter-scarred lands where German panzers once rolled with the arrogant ease of conquerors, carving deep tracks into Soviet soil, believing that nothing could stop them, that blitzkrieg was eternal, that momentum was destiny. But all of that changed the moment the KV-1 appeared from the swirling mist, its engine rumbling like an angry furnace, its heavy treads crushing frozen earth beneath it as if it were stepping over mere twigs, and from that instant onward, German soldiers spoke of it with a tone that was half frustration, half disbelief, and entirely fear, because the KV-1's armor, up to 75 mm thick, was something they had never encountered before on the battlefield, a metallic wall that shrugged off the impact of 37 mm anti-tank shells as though they were pebbles thrown against a fortress. And even the 50 mm guns of the Panzer III made only sparks dance across its hull, like the KV-1 was brushing off fireflies in the winter dusk, while inside, the Soviet crew, ordinary men pulled from farms, factories, and streets, sat glued to their posts with a mixture of pride, terror, and duty, knowing that they commanded a monster the Germans had never prepared for, and that realization gave them a kind of confidence that was rare in the early, chaotic months of Operation Barbarossa, when the Red Army was collapsing. Cities were burning, and entire divisions were being encircled and destroyed, yet here, in this steel colossus, they found something that didn't break, didn't flee, didn't crumble. It held, and because it held, thousands of retreating Soviet soldiers found time to regroup, reorganize, and fight another day. For German tank crews, the first encounters with the KV-1 felt like a nightmare, as though the Soviets had conjured a beast out of the earth itself, a machine that defied physics, and many described the horrifying moment when their armor-piercing shells bounced off the KV-1's sloped plates, ricocheting skyward or into the snow, leaving only scorch marks and shame, because no matter how many shots they fired, no matter what angle they attempted, nothing worked, and radio chatter filled with disbelief. "The shells aren't penetrating!" sent confusion spiraling through entire units, forcing German commanders to rewrite tactics on the fly, improvising in the midst of chaos. But the KV-1 was not only a symbol of protection for its crew, it was a juggernaut of destruction for its enemies, its 76.2 mm gun roaring like a thunderclap that shattered the cold morning calm, launching explosive rounds that split Panzer armor open like brittle ice, leaving German tankers crawling out of burning wrecks, choking on smoke, wondering how the Soviet Union, an enemy they believed backward and technologically inferior, had produced a machine that completely outclassed their prized armored divisions, and the psychological shock began to ripple across the front, because war is not only fought with weapons but with perception, and perception was swiftly shifting against the Germans. Before we continue, please let me know, did anyone in your family fight in or live through World War II? Share their stories in the comments. Let's continue the story. And then came the battle that became legend, whispered across both armies with awe and disbelief, a single KV-1, standing alone at a crossroads near Rzyni, blocking the advance path of an entire German panzer column, a lone steel titan position between the Wehrmacht and their objective, and for an entire day, that tank held its ground, refusing to fall, refusing to move aside, as though the spirit of the entire Soviet Union had been forged into its thick armor plates. The Germans threw everything at it: anti-tank guns, heavy artillery, infantry armed with grenades, even point-blank shots, and still it stood, flames licking its hull, armor blistered with impact marks, yet undented in its resolve, the crew inside battered by shockwaves, choking on fumes, sweat running down their soot-covered faces as they reloaded again and again, their ears ringing from each deafening blast of their own gun. While the German column piled up behind the wreckage, immobilized by this one machine that defied all logic, and the tank's commander, whose name history barely preserved, ordered his men to keep firing, keep fighting, keep standing, because they were the only line left, and if they fell, everything behind them would collapse, and somehow, impossibly, they held, turning the battle into a testament of willpower as much as steel. Inspiring Soviet morale and haunting German memories long after the wreck of that KV-1 was finally subdued through sheer exhaustion of every weapon the Germans could muster. But before that tank fell, it had already carved its reputation into the consciousness of the Eastern Front, and crews across the Soviet Union heard the story and whispered it with pride, while German soldiers muttered it with dread, because in that moment, the KV-1 had become more than a machine. It became a symbol that the German war machine, which until then seemed unstoppable, could indeed be stopped. And the Wehrmacht hated that realization, hated that a single tank could halt an entire advance, hated that their carefully crafted mythology of invincibility had been broken by the roar of a Soviet engine and the defiance of a Soviet crew, and even when they finally destroyed the lone tank, it was only after it had cost them time, ammunition, and morale they could not regain. And as the wreck of the KV-1 smoldered, its armor still warm from the countless shells that struck it, German soldiers approached it with caution and confusion, touching the steel as if expecting it to wake back up, staring at the hundreds of impact craters that covered it like scars, unable to understand how it had stood for so long, because this was supposed to be the era of German superiority. Yet the KV-1 made clear that the Soviets had weapons the Germans hadn't accounted for, weapons that could shift the balance of power in ways that terrified even the most seasoned Panzer commanders. Yet the KV-1 was more than steel and firepower. It was an idea, a towering symbol of defiance carved into the cold winds that swept across the Eastern Front, and as summer faded into the first whispers of winter, the German army began to understand that they were not simply fighting weapons, they were fighting a nation's will encased in iron, a stubborn, immovable force that refused to bend or fracture no matter the pressure exerted upon it, and the more they advanced, the more the KV-1 seemed to multiply in the minds of the infantry who whispered its name around campfires as if invoking a legend that walked on tracks, a beast forged in furnaces fueled by desperation and patriotism. And by the time the German command reached the outskirts of Leningrad, the KV-1 had already carved itself into the psyche of every forward unit. Because for every tank destroyed there were two more stories of invulnerability, of shells bouncing like raindrops, of crews who fought until the turret was breached and flames swallowed everything in red light, and so the KV-1 became both a physical and psychological barrier, something to be defeated in principle before it could ever be defeated in practice. But the Germans found no such moment of principle, no weakness, no tactical gap, because the KV-1 refused to behave like a machine. It advanced when logic said retreat, it endured when physics said collapse. It counterattacked when crews were outnumbered 10-1, and in the minds of German platoons, the KV-1 became less a tank and more a monolith, something ancient, immovable, elemental, a slab of iron that the earth itself had risen to oppose them, and one of the most chilling encounters was recorded by a German officer named Klaus Reinhardt, who described the sound of a KV-1 approaching through the forest at dusk, its engine a deep, growling heartbeat that vibrated through the branches. Its silhouette barely visible yet unmistakably massive, and Reinhardt wrote that the sight paralyzed his unit, men frozen with hands on weapons they knew were useless, their anti-tank rifles nothing more than sticks against a fortress, and though they fired, though they shouted, though they scattered, the KV-1 kept advancing, its treads crushing roots and branches with the inevitability of a glacier, and Reinhardt swore that for a moment he felt the forest itself cower as the tank passed, its armor absorbing every strike like a beast unfazed by insects. And when the KV-1 finally returned fire, it did so with the calm efficiency of a predator that knew the outcome of the hunt long before its prey did, and this battle, one of hundreds, if recorded in isolation might be dismissed as anecdotal, but the truth was that it reflected a pattern carved across the entire theater. The KV-1 was rewriting the expectations of combat, forcing German tacticians to rethink every chart, every scenario, every calculation that assumed dominance through experience and engineering, because Germany had built its war machine on the doctrine of blitzkrieg, speed, precision, lightning strikes that shattered the enemy before they could react. But the KV-1 broke that rhythm, turned that doctrine against its creators, because it refused to be shattered, refused to yield, and when Blitzkrieg slammed into a wall that would not break, all momentum died. And with it the illusion of invincibility that had carried Germany across Europe, and one officer later wrote that the KV1 froze there. Advanced not through fire but through fear, because every encounter with it forced them to move slower, think longer, doubt deeper, and those doubts spread like frost across the command structure, revealing cracks in German confidence long before the winter exposed cracks in their logistics. And as the months dragged on, the Germans began diverting resources, precious artillery, aircraft, fuel, just to counter the KV1. And yet the tank remained a phantom, appearing where least expected, vanishing into forests and marshes the moment German reinforcements arrived, and this mobility confused commanders who could not reconcile how such a heavy machine moved with such unpredictable fluidity. But the secret was not just the tank itself, it was the crews, hardened veterans drawn from mining towns, steel mills, frozen Siberian villages where stamina was not a trait but a necessity of survival. And these men treated the KV1 not as a vehicle but as an extension of their own endurance, pushing it through terrain that German engineers would have labeled impassable, using ravines as cover, frozen swamps as highways, tree lines as camouflage, and in doing so they turned the Eastern Front into a chessboard where every KV1 became a queen, unpredictable, powerful, capable of altering the outcome of entire operations through a single well-timed move, and nowhere was this more evident than during the defense of Leningrad, where a handful of KV1s anchored lines that should have collapsed under sheer numbers, their silhouettes looming on the horizon like iron guardians whose presence alone bought the city time to fortify, ration, and resist, and German soldiers, upon spotting them, often hesitated to advance, not from lack of orders but from the primal instinct that warned them they were approaching something that defied their understanding of warfare. And the psychological toll of these machines became so severe that German intelligence units began circulating pamphlets attempting to downplay the KV1's effectiveness, calling it slow, unwieldy, flawed, but the troops who had faced it knew better, and whispers spread faster than official reports. The KV1 could not be stopped, the KV1 could survive anything, the KV1 was death on tracks, and the most haunting of these accounts came from a group of German engineers sent to examine the wreckage of a KV1 that had finally been destroyed. And what they found unsettled them. The tank had absorbed more than 40 direct hits from anti-tank guns before its engine failed, and even then, the crew had continued firing until the turret burned from the inside out, leaving behind twisted remains that seemed less like a destroyed vehicle and more like a monument to stubborn defiance. And one engineer reportedly whispered, "If all Soviet tanks were built like this, the war would already be over." A statement that reflected the creeping realization that Germany's war machine, for all its precision and engineering, had underestimated the raw, brutal effectiveness of Soviet-designed philosophy, which prioritized survival, resilience, and battlefield adaptability over aesthetics or theoretical perfection, and as the Eastern Front stretched into its brutal second year, the KV1 did not diminish in relevance. In fact, its reputation only grew, evolving into a myth that German propagandists struggled to counter. Because every destroyed Panzer, every stalled offensive, every failed ambush was another brushstroke on the KV1's legend, and that legend reached its zenith during Operation Barbarossa's collapse, when scattered Soviet units, often isolated and without supply lines, formed armored islands of resistance using KV1s as immovable fortresses, delaying German advances by hours, sometimes days, and these delays compounded into strategic setbacks that altered timetables, overextended supply lines, and ultimately ensured that Germany's advance slowed just enough for winter to arrive early, and once winter took hold, the KV1 became even more terrifying, as its engine, designed for brutal Siberian cold, performed better than many German machines, allowing it to maneuver when Panzer engines froze and infantry rifles jammed, and German soldiers reported seeing KV1s emerging through blizzards like ghosts, their hulls coated in frost, their engines roaring like storms, and in those moments, the tank seemed less like a man-made machine and more like a force of nature summoned by the Russian winter itself. A force that seemed to blend with the sweeping snows, the distant howling winds, and the bitter, soul-numbing cold that punished every exposed inch of German skin, and in this frozen theater the KV1 took on an almost mythical role, its very presence an omen that the tide had begun to shift, because no matter how battered, how isolated, how surrounded a Soviet position became, if a KV-1 was dug in nearby, the defenders held just a little longer, fought just a little harder, believed just a little more strongly that the German advance could be stopped, and this belief mattered, because morale is a quiet weapon, unseen but devastating, and the KV-1 amplified it in ways few machines in history ever have, elevating ordinary infantry units into symbols of defiance simply because they fought alongside a tank whose armor embodied their stubborn refusal to succumb. And among the countless stories passed down through veterans, one stands out as the clearest representation of the KV-1's legacy, a small Soviet detachment holding a crossroads near Tikhvin, led by a single KV-1. If you already watched till this part, so please comment below your city name. Let's continue the story. Whose crew had long run out of hope but not courage, fighting through the night under artillery barrages that shook loose the frost from their turret, firing until the barrel glowed a deep furnace red, until the crew inside choked on smoke and exhaustion, yet they held, and in the morning the Germans found the KV-1 silent at last, its gun barrel lowered, its engine dead, but its track surrounded by a ring of destroyed vehicles and German bodies half buried in the snow, a sight that stunned even hardened officers, because though the tank had finally been killed, it had not been defeated, and its last stand became the kind of battlefield legend that outlives the men, outlives the war, outlives the era itself, and even after improved German weapons like the 88mm gun or the newer Panzer models eventually reduced the KV-1's battlefield dominance, its aura never truly faded. For the tank continued to fight with relentless persistence across the blood-soaked plains, from the forests of Karelia to the edge of the Dnieper, from burned-out villages whose names the world has forgotten to strategic cities whose fates shaped history, and in every place it appeared, the pattern repeated. The KV-1 absorbed punishment beyond reason, bought time when none remained, and anchored defenses that by all logic should have collapsed, and its crews, those quiet, exhausted, soot-covered men who coaxed life from engines that shook violently with every gear change, became the unsung backbone of the Soviet war machine, their stories written not in polished memoirs but in field reports, scattered recollections, and the rusting remains of their machines left across the vast expanse of the Eastern Front. And though the war evolved, though newer Soviet tanks like the T-34-85 and the IS series eventually overshadowed the KV-1 in firepower and mobility, none ever quite captured the raw, primitive defiance that the KV-1 embodied, for the KV-1 belonged to a specific moment in history, a moment defined by chaos, desperation, and the terrifying uncertainty of Operation Barbarossa, a moment when the fate of a nation hung by a thread and survival depended on machines that could not fail, and the KV-1 did not fail, not in purpose, not in spirit, not in the eyes of those who fought beside it or those who fought against it, and the Germans, even years later, spoke of it with a mixture of frustration, respect, and lingering unease, describing it as a tank that seemed oblivious to fear, a machine whose armor felt like an insult to their engineering, a blunt, unyielding reminder that the Soviet Union had prepared for a kind of war that Germany did not anticipate. And after the fall of Berlin, when the guns finally went silent and Europe exhaled for the first time in 6 years, the KV-1 faded quietly into scrapyards, training ranges, and museums, its steel corroding as decades passed. But its legend continuing to grow, whispered by historians, reenactors, veterans, and enthusiasts, who marveled at how a single design, so heavy, so simplistic, so brutally utilitarian, managed to halt the greatest invading force ever assembled. And today, when one stands before a surviving KV-1 resting on a concrete plinth, its armor scarred, its turret massive, its lines as blunt and unapologetic as the era that birthed it, there is a stillness that feels almost reverent. As if the tank itself remembers the thunder of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, the shouts of commanders, the screams of metal shearing under impact, the frozen nights when its engine roared defiantly against death, and the long, terrifying days when it stood alone against columns of advancing panzers, and in that stillness one can almost hear the echoes of those who crewed it, the loader who fed shells with numb fingers, the gunner who scanned the horizon through cracked optics. The driver whose hands trembled on the controls as the tank lurched through mud and snow, the commander who shouted orders over the deafening roar of the engine, each man aware that death was always seconds away yet choosing to fight anyway, and their courage, fused with the KV1's steel, created something larger than the sum of its parts, something that shaped the outcome of battles and the course of the war itself, and in the grand tapestry of World War II, where strategies, nations, ideologies, and millions of lives intertwined, the KV1 stands not merely as a machine of war but as a symbol of resilience, of sacrifice, of defiance carved in iron, a reminder that in the darkest hours of history, sometimes it is not the most advanced weapon, nor the most elegant design, but the one that refuses to break, refuses to yield, refuses to die, that changes everything. And as the Eastern Front continues to be studied by scholars and etched into the collective memory of humanity, the KV1's roar still echoes faintly across time, a ghostly engine rumbling through snow-covered forests, a reminder of the day one tank stopped a column, the days dozens more altered campaigns, and the years in which a single design helped shape the fate of continents, standing as a testament to the brutal, relentless power of human will forged into steel, a power that neither shells nor fear nor impossible odds could shatter. And so the KV1 lives on in history, in memory, and in myth, an iron giant born in fire, tested in frost, feared by enemies, revered by those it protected, forever remembered as the tank that terrified the Eastern Front and refused, again and again, to die. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.